seemed undeterred.
Cameron Wilson was 20 years old when he stood in the Western Cape High Court, clapping and shouting, "At least I'm still alive," as the judge read out 4 life sentences plus 71 years. The victims' families wept. Some hurled abuse at him, but Wilson just smiled and giggled. Now you might think this is just another story about a young psychopath. But what makes the Cameron Wilson case truly disturbing isn't just that he became South Africa's youngest serial killer. It's that every single system designed to stop someone like him failed, one after another, creating a perfect storm that left 5 people dead and countless others traumatized in Cape Town's most vulnerable communities. Cameron Wilson was born around 1997 in Heinz Park, a suburb on the Cape Flats. Now, if you don't know the Cape Flats, it's this sprawling area east of Cape Town that was created during apartheid for non-white residents. Today, it remains marked by poverty, unemployment, and some of the highest violent crime rates in the world. Heinz Park sits right in the middle of this environment, where gang territories are mapped out street by street and gunshots are part of the daily soundtrack. But here's where Wilson's story takes its first dark turn. His father, Abraham Wilson, wasn't just any Cape Flats resident. He was a known gang member who was serving time for a triple murder in Bishop Lavis. According to court documents, young Cameron would later call his father his mentor during probation reports. Think about that for a moment. While other kids had fathers teaching them to ride bikes or kick soccer balls, Cameron had a triple murderer as his role model. Now the defense would later argue that growing up with this kind of influence explained Cameron's behavior. They painted a picture of environmental determinism, where violence begets violence. But the prosecution's probation report revealed something unexpected. Despite his father's absence and criminal legacy, Cameron apparently grew up in what was described as a loving and supportive home. His family, minus the imprisoned father, tried to give him a normal childhood. This contradiction would become central to understanding Wilson. Was he a product of the Cape Flats' brutal environment? Or was something fundamentally broken inside him from the start? Professor Sean Kaliski, the forensic psychiatrist who would later evaluate Wilson, noted that genetics play a key role in psychopathy. But he couldn't rule out environmental triggers either. The nature versus nurture debate that criminologists love to argue about had found its perfect, terrible case study. By his teenage years, Wilson seemed like just another Cape Flats youth navigating a dangerous world. But beneath that surface, something was building. In 2015, while on remand for his first murders, he joined the 28's prison gang. His probation officer reported this was for protection, which is common in South African prisons. You align yourself with a number gang, or you become a target. But Wilson's crimes would prove to be something entirely different from gang violence. They followed no criminal code, served no territorial purpose, brought no profit. They were purely personal, driven by impulses that even hardened criminals would struggle to understand. October 2014. Wilson was just 17 years old when he crossed the line from violence to murder. His first known victim was Alfonso Van Rooyen, age 25, stabbed to death on Daffodil Street in Heinz Park. 3 days later, same neighborhood, Toyher Stober, age 30, was gunned down in his car. Now at first glance, these might look like typical Cape Flats killings. Young men dying violently in gang territory is tragically common. Police investigations included eyewitness testimony from neighbors, but in communities where snitching can get you killed, witnesses often see nothing, hear nothing, know nothing. The murders went unsolved initially. There was no obvious pattern yet, no reason to think these weren't just more casualties in the endless turf wars. Then came December 26, 2014. Ernest Johannes Erasmus was stabbed and killed in Bishop Lavis. Another young man, another violent death, another case that didn't immediately stand out in the Cape Flats' grim statistics. But investigators would later realize these weren't random gang hits or drug deals gone wrong. Wilson was using different weapons, attacking in different ways. Knives for some victims, guns for others. The forensic teams would eventually match wound patterns to an Okapi-style knife, a folding blade that's become synonymous with South African street violence. Ballistic analysis linked the Stober shooting. But at this point, nobody had connected these dots. Nobody realized a serial killer was emerging. What made these early murders particularly chilling in retrospect was their lack of clear motive. Van Rooyen, Stober, and Erasmus weren't rival gang members. They weren't witnesses to crimes. They weren't robbery victims. Wilson killed them because he could, because something in him had switched off, or perhaps had never been switched on in the first place. The normal human barriers to taking a life, the empathy, the conscience, the fear of consequences, none of it seemed to register with him. By early 2015, Wilson had killed at least 3 people, and nobody knew they were dealing with a serial offender. The Cape Flats sees hundreds of murders each year. In that context, 3 dead men in different incidents over several months barely registered as connected events. The system's first failure was simply not seeing the pattern. But the next failure would be far worse. April 24, 2015. Chicken in a Basket Tavern in Ottery, just south of Heinz Park. The tavern, known locally as a shebeen, was a Friday night gathering spot for young people in the area. These informal establishments are more than just bars. They're community spaces where people escape the daily pressures of Cape Flats life, if only for a few hours. The music was playing, people were talking and laughing, and 16-year-old Stacy Lee Mohale was there with friends, doing what teenagers do on weekend evenings. Wilson walked in that night carrying more than just the physical weapons he would use. He carried with him the knowledge that he had already killed at least 3 people, Van Royen, Stober, and Erasmus, and faced no consequences. The system hadn't even connected those murders to him yet. In his mind, shaped by psychopathy and emboldened by impunity, he was untouchable. According to court testimony, the encounter with Mohale began with what witnesses described as a seemingly minor altercation. The exact trigger remains unclear, perhaps a perceived slight, a rejected advance, or simply Wilson's predatory instincts identifying a victim. What started as words quickly escalated. Wilson physically assaulted Mohale, striking her in front of the crowd. But this was just the beginning. The knife came next. Witnesses would later describe the shocking speed of the escalation. Wilson attacked Mohale with the blade, inflicting serious wounds. But even this wasn't enough for him. In an act that defied comprehension even in a community hardened by violence, Wilson used fire as a weapon. Both Mohale and her friend were attacked with flames. The friend, whose identity has been protected by authorities, survived but required extensive medical treatment for severe burns. The physical scars would heal slowly, the psychological trauma would last much longer. Mohale died from her injuries at the scene. She was 16 years old. The tavern erupted in chaos. Some patrons fled in terror. Others tried to help the victims. Someone called for emergency services. And crucially, multiple witnesses clearly identified Wilson as the attacker. This wasn't a mysterious crime that would require months of investigation. This was murder committed in front of numerous witnesses in a public place. Wilson was arrested shortly after. For the families of his previous victims, though they didn't know he was responsible yet, and for the community that had been living in fear of an unknown killer, it seemed like a turning point. The system had him. A 16-year-old girl was dead, her friend severely injured, and there were multiple eyewitnesses. The evidence was overwhelming. The bail hearing that followed should have been straightforward. In South African law, bail can be denied when the accused poses a danger to the community or when the crime is of such severity that release would undermine public confidence in the justice system. The murder of Stacy Lee Mohale met both criteria: the extreme violence used, the public nature of the attack, the age of the victim, the presence of multiple witnesses. Everything pointed to denying bail. But here's where the system failed catastrophically. Wilson was granted bail. The specific magistrate who made this decision hasn't been publicly identified, standard practice in South African courts to protect judicial officers from retaliation. But whoever they were, they made a decision that would have deadly consequences. The amount of bail and specific conditions haven't been made public, but whatever they were, they proved wholly inadequate. Now, to understand how shocking this was, you need to understand South African bail law. The Criminal Procedure Act allows for bail in most cases, but Schedule 6 offenses, including premeditated murder, require the accused to show exceptional circumstances to be released. The burden is on the accused to prove they should be released, not on the state to prove they should be detained. Yet somehow Wilson convinced a magistrate that he met this high bar. The prosecution would later call this decision incomprehensible. Legal experts struggled to understand how someone who had committed such extreme violence in public could be released. Some speculated about overcrowding in remand facilities, others about possible procedural errors, still others about the magistrate simply not grasping the severity of what Wilson had done. The community's reaction was immediate and visceral. Terror spread through Heinz Park and surrounding areas. Parents who had already been keeping their children close now barely let them out of sight. Young women traveled in groups, avoided being out after dark. The message the bail decision sent was devastating. Even if you murder a child in front of witnesses, you can walk free while awaiting trial. For Wilson, the message was different but equally clear. The system had caught him in the act of murder and then released him. What did that tell someone whose psychiatric evaluation would later reveal he was incapable of normal empathy or remorse? It told him he was untouchable. It confirmed what his psychopathic mind might already have believed, that rules and consequences were for other people, not for him. Between his release on bail in September 2016, Wilson didn't lay low or try to avoid attention as someone grateful for their freedom might. Instead, he escalated. He moved through the Cape Flats with the confidence of someone who believed himself beyond consequences. And why wouldn't he? He had murdered a teenager in public and walked free. During this period, Wilson committed additional violent crimes that would only come to light during his trial. He assaulted Cody Philander in 2015, an attack that showed his violence wasn't limited to female victims. More seriously, he raped Donnie Davids, a crime for which he would eventually receive one of his life sentences. Each incident showed not just continuation, but escalation, more violence, more cruelty, more complete disregard for human suffering. What makes this period particularly tragic is that Wilson was supposed to be awaiting trial for murder. In theory, he should have been under some form of supervision. Bail conditions typically include regular check-ins with police, restrictions on movement, perhaps a curfew, but whatever conditions were imposed, they clearly weren't enforced effectively. Wilson was able to continue his reign of terror unchecked. The bail system in South Africa, like in many countries, tries to balance several competing interests. There's the presumption of innocence, the idea that someone is innocent until proven guilty and shouldn't be punished with detention before conviction. There's the practical reality of overcrowded prisons and long trial delays. And there's public safety and the integrity of the justice system. In Wilson's case, that balance didn't just tip, it completely collapsed. One has to wonder about the magistrate who granted bail. Did they review the evidence properly? Did they understand the nature of the violence involved? Were they simply overwhelmed with cases and made a rushed decision? Or was there something else? Incompetence, corruption, or simple human error with deadly consequences? These questions remain unanswered, buried in sealed court records and protected by judicial privilege. The failure to deny Wilson bail represents more than just one bad decision. It represents a systemic failure to protect vulnerable communities from dangerous offenders. It shows how the justice system, designed with noble principles of fairness and presumption of innocence, can be manipulated or can simply fail when faced with someone like Wilson, someone whose psychopathy makes them fundamentally different from the typical accused person the system was designed to process. If someone had connected the dots between the earlier murders, Van Rooyen, Stober, Erasmus, would Wilson have been treated differently? If the magistrate had looked at the nature of the violence against Stacey Lee Mohali and recognized it as extraordinary even by Cape Flats standards, would bail have been denied? If the system had any mechanism for identifying and flagging potential serial offenders, would Wilson have been stopped sooner? These questions torment the families of Wilson's victims and the communities he terrorized. Because every crime Wilson committed while on bail, every assault, the rape of Donnie Davids, and ultimately the murder of Lakita Moore, could have been prevented if the system had kept him in custody where he belonged. The bail decision didn't just fail Stacey Lee Mohale and her family, it failed everyone Wilson would harm in the 17 months between his release and his final arrest. September 11, 2016. Lakita Moore, 18 years old, had been singing karaoke in Valhalla Park, a Cape Flats suburb adjacent to Bishop Levis. She was described by her father Charles as my everything, a young woman with her whole life ahead of her. After the karaoke session, she was abducted. Her body was discovered in an open field on Tuna Street near an area called 8th Lawn. When investigators arrived at the scene, even veteran Cape Town detectives who'd seen the worst of gang violence were shocked. Moore had been stabbed 98 times. Let me repeat that. 98 times. Her naked body showed evidence of rape and extreme mutilation. Her face had been slashed. The overkill indicated something far beyond normal criminal violence. This was rage, sadism, or perhaps something even harder to understand, a complete disconnection from human emotion. The crime scene was immediately sealed for forensic examination. In a field adjacent to informal settlements, investigators meticulously documented every wound, every piece of evidence, and this time, they got what they needed. DNA evidence was collected that would prove crucial. When the results came back, they pointed directly to Cameron Wilson. Now here's where it gets interesting from an investigative standpoint. Wilson was still out on bail for the Mohali murder when Moore's body was discovered. Police had been seeking him, and according to reports, he was found near the scene. Some accounts suggest a tip led them to him, others that evidence immediately linked him. Either way, in September 2016, Cape Town detectives finally arrested Cameron Wilson for what they hoped would be the last time. But the arrest was just the beginning of uncovering the full scope of Wilson's crimes. As investigators dug deeper, they found connections to the earlier murders. The DNA evidence from Moore's body was damning, but it also opened up new investigative avenues. According to court records, when Wilson was confronted with the DNA test results during the trial, he changed his story. This is classic behavior for someone who's been lying, suddenly having to adjust their narrative when faced with irrefutable scientific evidence. The murder of Lakita Moore would become the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, not just because of the forensic evidence, but because of what it revealed about Wilson's psychology. The excessive violence, the sexual assault, the post-mortem mutilation, all of it painted a picture of someone who didn't just kill, but who took pleasure in the act of killing. Prosecutor advocate Corrine Tunison would later describe Wilson's crimes as extremely gruesome and misogynistic. She noted that he seemed to target women who defied him in some way, though with Wilson's distorted psychology, that defiance might have been as simple as saying no or looking at him wrong. When Professor Sean Kaliski examined Cameron Wilson at Valkenburg Hospital's forensic unit, he was looking for answers to questions that the court desperately needed resolved. Was Wilson mentally ill? Was he legally insane? Could he be held responsible for his crimes? Kaliski's findings were chilling but clear. Wilson scored extremely high on the psychopathy checklist, specifically the PCLR, which is the standard tool for assessing psychopathic traits. Now, psychopathy isn't what Hollywood usually shows us. It's not hearing voices or having multiple personalities. It's something arguably more frightening. It's the absence of empathy, remorse, and normal human emotional connections, combined with manipulative behavior and often above-average intelligence. Wilson showed no psychosis. He wasn't delusional. He knew exactly what he was doing when he killed. He understood that it was wrong in the legal and social sense. He just didn't care. This is the crucial distinction that would determine his legal fate. In South African law, as in most legal systems, being a psychopath doesn't excuse you from criminal responsibility. You have to be unable to understand the nature and wrongfulness of your acts, and Wilson understood perfectly well. He just lacked the emotional barriers that stop most people from acting on violent impulses. During his evaluation, Wilson made a revealing admission. He acknowledged joining the 28's prison gang in 2015 while on remand. This showed strategic thinking, self-preservation instincts, and understanding of prison hierarchy and dangers. Someone truly insane wouldn't navigate prison politics so pragmatically. This was someone who could plan, who could make calculated decisions, who could present different faces to different people when it served his purposes. The psychiatric evaluation also delved into the nature versus nurture question that haunted this case. Kaliski agreed that genetics are key in psychopathy. Some people are simply born with brains that don't process empathy and emotion normally. But he also couldn't rule out environmental factors. Growing up in the Cape Flats, having a triple murderer for a father, being surrounded by violence from birth, these things don't create psychopathy, but they might trigger or amplify it in someone already predisposed. What emerged from the psychiatric assessment was a portrait of someone the system couldn't fix. The court would later accept Kaliski's evaluation that Wilson had very limited chances of being rehabilitated. This wasn't someone who killed in a moment of passion or because of circumstances. This was someone who killed because something fundamental in his psychological makeup was profoundly and permanently broken. Now, testifying in any murder trial takes courage, but testifying in the Cape Flats, where gang retaliation is a real threat and the no-snitching culture runs deep, that takes a special kind of bravery. Yet in Cameron Wilson's trial, over 40 witnesses came forward. These weren't police officers or professional witnesses. These were ordinary residents of Heinz Park, Valhalla Park, Bishop Lavis. People who lived in the same streets where Wilson had hunted. People who knew that identifying him in court could make them targets. Some had been explicitly threatened. The court record notes that witnesses suffered trauma when Wilson changed his story after the DNA evidence was revealed, meaning they had to relive their experiences and face accusations of lying. Charles Moore, Lakita's father, stood in court and spoke about his daughter. "She was my everything," he said. He called Wilson what he was, a serial killer who had taken my source of energy. The pain in those words represents not just one father's loss, but the collective trauma Wilson inflicted on his community. Graham Lindhorst, a community police forum chairperson, praised the sentence and what it meant for the community. These forums are grassroots organizations where residents try to work with police to improve safety. For someone in that position to speak out publicly showed that the community had reached a breaking point. They were more afraid of Wilson walking free than they were of any gang retaliation. The witness's testimony revealed the reign of terror Wilson had created. This wasn't just about the people he killed, it was about the fear that gripped entire neighborhoods. Parents kept children indoors. Women walked in groups. Everyone wondered if they might randomly become the next victim. Because unlike gang violence, which usually has rules and logic however twisted, Wilson's violence was unpredictable. You couldn't avoid it by staying out of gang business or drug trade. You could be targeted for no reason at all. Some witnesses described seeing Wilson's behavior in court, how he smiled and giggled as evidence was presented, how he showed no emotion when victims' families cried, how he seemed to enjoy the attention, the power he had to cause pain even from the defendant's dock. This behavior reinforced what the psychiatric evaluation had found. This wasn't someone who could be reached by normal human emotion or reasoning. The National Prosecuting Authority later thanked these witnesses specifically in their media release. SAP's Provincial Commissioner Lieutenant General Kumbinkosi Jula praised not just the police work, but the community cooperation. Because without these 40 brave voices, Wilson might have walked free. The DNA evidence was crucial, but witness testimony provided context, established patterns, and showed the court the full scope of Wilson's crimes. August 24, 2017, the Western Cape High Court was packed for Wilson's sentencing. Victims' families filled the gallery, media lined the walls. Everyone wanted to see what justice would look like for Cameron Wilson. Judge Chantel Fortuan had presided over the 51-day trial. She'd heard all the evidence, seen Wilson's behavior, reviewed the psychiatric reports. Now she had to decide not just on guilt, which had been established on 13 of 15 charges, but on what sentence could possibly fit these crimes. The prosecution had asked the court to deviate from prescribed minimum sentences due to what they called the cruel and gruesome nature of the crimes. They cited substantial and compelling circumstances, legal language that basically means the crimes were so horrific that normal sentencing guidelines weren't enough. Judge Fortuan agreed. She handed down 4 life sentences for the murders of Mohal and Moore, for the rape of Donnie Davids, and for another murder. These would run concurrently, meaning Wilson would serve them at the same time. Then came additional fixed terms. 15 years for Van Rooyen's murder, more years for Erasmus, years for attempted murder, assault, weapons possession. All told, 4 life terms plus 71 years. Under South African law, a life sentence means you're eligible for parole after 25 years. So theoretically, Wilson could be released when he's 45 years old. Prosecutor Tunison described his chances of rehabilitation as very limited. The victims' families were more direct. They said he should never walk free, ever. But here's what happened next, the moment that would crystallize who Cameron Wilson really was. As Judge Fortuan read the sentence, as the victims' families finally saw some measure of justice, Wilson started clapping. He shouted, "At least I'm still alive!" He smiled. He giggled. The families erupted. Some screamed at him. Some cried harder. Some had to be restrained. Because even in that moment, when any normal person would show some fear, some regret, some recognition of what they'd lost, Wilson was performing. He was enjoying the pain he was causing. He was being exactly what Professor Kaliski had diagnosed, a psychopath incapable of human empathy. Wilson was taken to Polesmore Prison, where he's held in a single cell for his own protection. Even among criminals, what he did makes him a target. He'll be eligible for parole in 2042, though given the nature of his crimes and his psychological profile, release seems unlikely. But that uncertainty, that possibility, however remote, continues to haunt the families of his victims. The Western Cape Police Commissioner said communities were safer with Wilson behind bars. That's undoubtedly true, but safety is relative in the Cape Flats. Wilson was caught, convicted, and sentenced. The system eventually worked, but only after it had failed repeatedly, catastrophically, with deadly consequences. What the Cameron Wilson case really reveals isn't just about one psychopath's journey through the justice system. It's about the vulnerabilities in that system. The bail decision that let a killer walk free. The failure to connect multiple murders until it was too late. The psychiatric services that could diagnose but not prevent. The community so overwhelmed by violence that a serial killer could initially blend into the background noise of daily brutality. Charles Moore still lives with the loss of his daughter. He told media that justice for my daughter is never going to happen because no sentence could bring Lakayda back. The mother of Lakayda became so traumatized she developed an addiction to tic, methamphetamine, and needed psychiatric care. Mohale's friend who survived being set on fire bears permanent scars. The witnesses who testified live with the fear that there might be retaliation someday. The communities of Heinz Park, Valhalla Park, and Bishop Lavis continue to struggle with poverty, gang violence, and all the conditions that created the environment where Wilson could hunt. There's an ongoing debate in South Africa about what creates someone like Cameron Wilson. The forensic psychiatrists say it's primarily genetic, that some people are born without the capacity for empathy. The sociologists point to the Cape Flats history, the apartheid geography that concentrated poverty and violence, the absent fathers and present gangs. The legal scholars argue about bail procedures and sentencing guidelines. Everyone has theories. But maybe the most unsettling truth is that we don't really know. We don't know why Cameron Wilson became what he became. We don't know how to prevent the next one. We don't know if he was born evil or made evil or some terrible combination of both. What we do know is that between 2014 and 2016, he carved a path of horror through some of Cape Town's most vulnerable communities. We know that multiple systems failed to stop him until 5 people were dead. We know that 40 brave witnesses risked everything to make sure he was held accountable. And we know that somewhere in Polesmore Prison, Cameron Wilson sits in a single cell, eligible for parole in 2042, a reminder that some forms of human darkness defy explanation or redemption. The Cape Flats continue to struggle with violence. Since Wilson's conviction, there have been other murders, other tragedies, other failures of the system. But his case stands apart, not because the violence was worse than what the Cape Flats usually sees, but because it was different. It followed no rules, served no purpose, achieved no goal except the satisfaction of impulses most of us can't understand. In a place where violence usually has a logic, however twisted, Cameron Wilson represented something else entirely. Violence for its own sake, killing for the pleasure of killing, evil in its purest and most incomprehensible form. So when we ask what created Cameron Wilson, maybe we're asking the wrong question. Maybe the question isn't what created him, but what allowed him to do what he did for so long. What kind of system grants bail to someone who burns teenagers alive? What kind of investigation doesn't connect multiple similar murders? What kind of society produces witnesses brave enough to testify despite death threats, yet can't protect its children from predators like Wilson in the first place? These are uncomfortable questions without easy answers. They force us to look not just at one psychopath, but at the entire structure that enabled him. They remind us that justice delivered too late is justice denied for those who didn't survive to see it. And they leave us with the unsettling realization that somewhere out there, perhaps in the Cape Flats, perhaps elsewhere, another Cameron Wilson might be starting down the same dark path, and we still don't know how to stop them before it's too late.